Back to Hebrews. So we talked about the writer is writing to Gentile Christians who are considering turning to Judaism, becoming God-fearers again rather than Christians. God-fearers, I know I've talked about this before, but God-fearers was a term, and it actually, something similar to that is in the New Testament. But that was what Gentiles were called that were in the Jewish worship, that participated in the Jewish worship. So there were basically three levels. You could be a Jew or you could be a Jewish proselyte, which really was only important for men because that if you were a Jewish proselyte, you were circumcised into Judaism. But far more common would have been these God-fearers, people who aligned themselves with Jewish worship, maybe worshiped the other gods as well, but weren't Jews themselves. They were Gentiles. These Christians were going to go back to that and leave Christianity behind, keeping Jesus as the Messiah, but as a Jewish Messiah, not as the Son of God that he was for Christianity. So, talked about what do you believe about Christ, and this is so for you to get into their shoes and see how they're thinking. And the two angles on this would have been a prophet who had risen, as is described in the Gospels, that the people were saying about Jesus while he was here, or the notion that he was some kind of special angel, also risen and elevated by God. So the question for Hebrews, really the point of the book, is where does Jesus belong in the hierarchy of the cosmos? And anywhere in between man and God would have been where these people would have been thinking about him. And we're going to get rid of a couple of these arrows as we go forward here. So we've spent a whole lot of time in the first four verses, especially these verse 3 and 4 for the last few weeks. We're moving on today, but as the hinge point for moving on, talks about Jesus sitting down on the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become much superior to angels, as is the name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. What is the name that he inherited? What is this name? He doesn't specifically spell it out here. He just refers to the name that he's inherited. So what is the name? And that really gets to this question. The name that Jesus has inherited places him somewhere in this direction. Nobody that he was writing to would have put him at this point. They would all have seen him subordinate to God. Even as God's Son, the Messiah, he would have still been below God the Father in their minds. So that's the direction that the writer of the book of Hebrews is trying to push them. Some of them had him here, some of them might have had him here, but he's superior to the angels. He makes that point right away. And so that's where we're headed as we move into verse 5. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? Or again, "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son"? And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all God's angels worship him." His point being, God clearly has said that this name that we're talking about is more than angels, more than man. He's my son, which places him above all of that. So here's where we're going in this verse, in this chapter. The rest of this chapter, all of these Old Testament references, he's going to apply to this problem to point these people in the right direction. So we'll go through all of these as we get through here, starting with Psalm chapter 2. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today have I begotten you"? This is from Psalm 2. It is, if not the most used Old Testament reference in the New Testament. It competes for that position. Psalm 2 is used a lot in the New Testament. This same verse, which is verse 7, which we're going to look at, of Psalm 2, is also quoted in Acts 13. Luke has it on the lips of Paul as Paul is preaching. Paul uses it. "You are my son, today have I begotten you." And we'll talk about this Greek word that comes from the base word geneo as we go through this. So let's go through Psalm 2. And because it is, again, like I said, one of the, if not the most used Old Testament scripture in the New Testament. Not just the part that we're looking at, not just verse 7, but lots of it. "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us burst their bonds apart and cast their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill." This psalm is God addressing his king. So this is what is often seen as an enthronement hymn. When they would put a king on the throne in Israel, this would be used as part of the ceremony. That's how this is often looked upon. That's definitely the sense that you get from reading it. So it starts off here in verse 2, God is speaking. The kings of the earth, through here, in verse 3, we see where God starts interjecting himself into this. But it begins in verse 2, "The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord," against God. But in the same way that they're against God, they're also against his anointed. Who is God's anointed? Specifically, what I'm asking you is, what is that word? In the Old Testament, if you're God's anointed, what does that make you? That's the word Messiah. So what that literally says is they've aligned themselves against God and his Messiah, his anointed. So if you are the anointed of God, you're the Messiah of God. So it's like a lot of the words that we have added to our theological lexicon. It can mean anointed or it can mean anointed. Either it's someone who's been anointed or it's that one Messiah that we all think of when we hear the word. And you have to keep that in mind as you're looking at these things. So this is a royal enthronement psalm declaring Israel's king to be God's son, declaring Israel's king to be the anointed. The emphasis here is when this psalm was put into the book of Psalms, when this psalm was being sung in ancient Israel, the person that originally wrote it, do you think they had Jesus in mind when they wrote it? I mean, they couldn't, we can't think that they would have assumed to have known everything that was going to happen in the New Testament, right? To their mind, they were only writing this about the Jewish king. It becomes prophetic as God makes it prophetic, not as man did. It wasn't man's idea, but it was God's idea that made it prophetic. So the people who put it into place and used it in ancient times in Israel were using it as a way to honor the king. So we have to kind of look at it both ways. You have to look at it the way they used it and the way it came to be used in the New Testament, because you've got all the apostles using it theologically. talking about Jesus. So let's go through it a little bit. Why do the nations rage? The peoples plot in vain. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel against the Lord and against his anointed. Israel is sitting there, and it's surrounded by enemies. So this is the typical paranoia that people felt at that time, that all these enemies are against us and we need someone to protect us. Those enemies are coming after us, therefore they're coming after God's anointed and coming after God himself. Because in those days, if you defeated a people, you also defeated their God, because their God wasn't strong enough to keep you from defeating them. That's the way they're thinking. Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens, God, laughs. The Lord holds them in derision, and he will speak to them in his wrath, terrify them in his fury. So he's coming for the enemies, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. So God has placed his king on Mount Zion, Jerusalem, his holy hill. So God determines who the king's going to be, and God is putting his blessing on the king. And so we're aligning his anointed, his Messiah, with his king. So if you are the king of Israel, you're God's Messiah. So this gets applied more specifically later, as after the Babylonian captivity, there is no king. And so the king becomes the future Messiah as we follow through all of that. So then we get to verse 7, which is the one we're interested in for this verse in Hebrews. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, so this is the king. Whoever the king is, this is what God says to the king. You are my son. Today have I begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. All you have to do is ask, King of Israel, and I will destroy your enemies. That's what God is saying here. You are my son. By being king, that makes you my son. This is not an unusual thing. This was a common way of thinking in that time. Not just in Israel, but everywhere. If the king, whoever was leading the nation, a king, was often considered a son of God and was talked about as a son of God. And we're going to have another example of this in the Old Testament in just a minute, because it's actually quoted in verse 5 in Hebrews. Ask of me, and I will make all the nations your heritage. I will put them all in your hand. Verse 10, now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. So now God is no longer addressing the king, he's addressing the enemies of the king. Therefore, O kings, be wise and be warned, O rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, kiss the King, bless the King, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So all of this applies to the King of Israel at the time. All of this also easily can be applied to Jesus, the future Messiah. And in fact, you will see in verse 9 where it talks about anointed of God breaking them with a rod of iron. You've heard that phrase, rod of iron, before in sermons and that sort of thing. It's all in the book of Revelation. It occurs in the book of Revelation repeatedly that he will lead them, he will rule them with a rod of iron, referring directly back to here. So that king, the king of the earth, who comes in at the end of the book of Revelation, is throughout the book of Revelation referred to as ruling with a rod of iron. When he comes back, he will rule with a rod of iron. So that's another place that we see this this psalm being used a lot. So you get the idea. The king ruling and the king being the Son of God, the anointed. Let's take it back to where we came from now. This is what the writer of Hebrews is quoting. You are my son, today have I begotten you. This is what it looks like in Greek. And you can see that the quote, if you looked at it closely, the quote in Hebrews is identical to what it is in the book of Psalms in the Septuagint. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it's identical. He quotes it word for word. And he uses this word here, geneo, which is a very common word in the New Testament. It means to start something. So it is used, like Genesis. It is used broadly, but when you're talking about someone being generated, being created, or being started by someone else, you're talking about them being born. So that's how we end up with the word of, that's how it comes out to be begotten. That's the way the Greek language at that time described birth, because they didn't have another word that they used for that. This is the way they said begotten. So it is accurately translated when you see it say, today I have begotten thee. So I won't make you look at the Hebrew, but this is a direct translation of the Hebrew. This is word for word what the Hebrew says. I declare concerning a statute, Jehovah said unto me, my son you are, today have I birthed you. And that's the Hebrew word yalad, which does literally mean to give birth. It's not like this abstract description in Greek, which means to start or generate. It's literally the word birth. I have birthed you. So that's why when we see it translated into English in the New Testament, it's very accurate to translate it begotten, because that's what it was in the Hebrew. For which of the angels did God ever say to, you are my son, today have I begotten you, given birth to you? And then he adds to that, or again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Here we have the exact same idea from Psalm 2. This is what you do with a king. With the king, God is your father, you are his son. We know that because of where he's quoting this from. It's in Chronicles as well, but this is the more specific reference, 1 Samuel 7. Here's David has reached a point in his life where he's ready to build the temple. He's done his conquering and he's ready to build the temple, and he tells Nathan he wants to build God a temple, and Nathan says it's okay, but then sleeps on it, and God tells him no, it's not okay. He sends him back the next day, and Nathan tells him, this is what God says. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So who's this referring to? Both answers are correct. Solomon and Jesus, because they are both of the lineage of David, according to the theology, according to the scriptures. Specifically, very specifically, Solomon, his son, ends up building the temple. And then down the line, Jesus becomes part of, he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Works with both. That's how this whole theology is being laid out in Hebrews. Verse 14, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. So that works for Jesus. God is his father. He's the son of God. But it also works for Solomon, because of what we saw in Psalm 2. It's the same thing here. The anointed king of Israel is the son of God. So I will be to him a father, he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men and with the stripes of sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Here is the reference that the writer of the book of Hebrews is making. I will be to him a father, he shall be to me a son. What is he saying? Jesus is God's anointed, Jesus is God's son because he's God's anointed. So there he lays that's the foundation of his entire argument throughout the beginning of the book. So he's making this Christological declaration. Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, which does what? It places him in that position above the angels. He's established the Christology that we're all familiar with, which places Jesus where we expect Jesus to be placed. But it also creates a Christological problem, which is why we now have a Trinity. Because it's not just good enough to say that he's God's son because of all the other things that come in to that argument. How is Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God? That question has to be answered. That's why for the next 3 centuries after this was written, the debates continued until we had the establishment of the Trinity. Which is it? Which is better theologically is the question. Because, to go back to what we were talking about a minute ago, it says, and this is our problem, you are my son, today I have what? So that implies that God gave birth to him in some way. That Jesus wasn't always, that he just started at some point. So there's the theological problem that we're left with that has to be explained. Was it birthed or adopted? And which is better? What Psalm 2, the language in Psalm 2 is actually language of adoption, not birth. So to say here in the New Testament, quoting Psalm 2, that Jesus was God's begotten son, doesn't mean that God gave birth to him at all. Because God didn't give birth to any of the kings in the Old Testament. And whenever somebody became king in any nation, it wasn't that God gave birth to them and that's why they became king. They became king, and thus God did what? He adopted them. They are his adopted son, not his birthed son. And that was the same language that's what's understood in Psalm 2. And we don't get that the way we read it because we are not 4,000 years old. But if we were, really it's more like 3,000 years old. If we were 3,000 years old, we would think of it in those terms. We weren't thinking that God literally gave birth to David or to Solomon or any of them. He adopted them as his son. So that's the way they were thinking about it. Now, this changes the whole definition that we see. Changes the whole way we think about things. For example, with John 3:16. Because John 3:16 uses this same word, and we always translate it begotten, but what do we think begotten means? Birth. He is my only birthed son. That's not what the verse is saying. He's my begotten son in this same way. He is my adopted son. So that's what the language is now. Whether or not we're not. So to get back to the slide, the theology and the language aren't the same because we don't approach it as Jesus being God's adopted son. But that's where we get all of this. That's where all of this starts in the Old Testament. And so we have to ask the question, which is it? Which is better? If God gave birth to Jesus or if God adopted Jesus? It works either way. It works both ways. And that's why we're left with this theological problem. That's why for 3 centuries they keep arguing about it. Because they see this problem. And they have to get it worked out. If he's adopted, it implies that he's not as important as if he's birthed. So we have to solve that problem. And that's another reason we have this whole Trinitarian argument that takes place. Now, for which of the angels did he say to you, you are my son? Today I have begotten you, which basically means to be adopted. I will be to him a father, he shall be to me a son, adopted. The problems continue with this whole line of thinking because the next verse that he quotes in verse 6 is this. And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, so Jesus is the firstborn that he brings into the world. And we get that from verse 3, remember, in verse 4. So he says, let all God's angels worship him. You see the problem that creates. God brings forth the firstborn into the world, Jesus, and tells the angels to worship him. Well, we just saw 3 verses ago that Jesus created everything that was created. At least that's what it says. All things were created through him. But the angels, when Jesus shows up, worship him. So this, and the only reason I point this out is to explain again, this is why there were 3 centuries of debate about who Jesus is and what is his position. Because all of these problems show up, and you can't just say God didn't explain it to us. So what does that mean we need to do? We need to explain it to God. And that's what happens for 3 centuries. How is Jesus the Son of God? And for 3 centuries, the Christological debate continues until we hammer it out, declare the Trinity, and say that's the end of the argument, which it wasn't. They still debated it for 3 more centuries after that. But eventually it became the theology of Christianity. So we'll move on from here. This also an Old Testament quote, and we'll look at that next week, and we'll go from there.